because when you can maintain this more direct level of consciousness, then you're more able to notice all these kind of habitual patterns and these things that you're doing, things that are affecting you without realizing that they're affecting you. Things that you're doing.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Vynn and Francis. Today we have on our show Michael Ashcroft, who is known for his courses on Alexander technique. So, welcome to the show, Michael. Tell us
Hello, thanks for having me.
Francis, how are you doing?
Yeah, good. I'm looking forward to this. I used to do Alexander technique a long time ago, about 20 years ago. But before I knew I was aphantasic, a very different period. So I'm interested to think about it in this new way.
Fabulous. So before I go on, Michael, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into Alexander technique?
Sure. So, fairly unconventional way of getting into it, actually. For most of my career, I was a STEM nerd. I did physics university. I spent 10 years doing energy innovation in the UK energy sector. And at the same time, in parallel to that, I've always had tremendously bad issues with my knees. Since I was like 11 years old, they would dislocate. And now at age 36, I have osteoarthritis in both my knees and my hips. So that's a whole thread of my life that has informed all of this. And around 25, I was having a really weird period of knee anxiety and worried about my health. And for some reason, the term Alexander technique was in my head. I think I had singing lessons back at school and the teacher kind of mentioned it, but it then lay dormant there for another 10 years. And I looked it up, I got a book, and my colleague at work where I had this book said, oh, there's a school around the corner for that. I walk past it every day. You should go check it out. And I did. So it was next to my office, and I was expecting to go in for something, like I said, that would help my knees, that would be some postural thing, and it would whatever. And I went for my first lesson, and I realized that it was something else completely. And I think my first lesson or second lesson, I basically walked back to my office in this state of profound, vivid, blissed out something or other that was like, okay, there's a lot more here than I thought there was. And as luck would have it, again, they were just starting to run a teacher training. And looking back, it was much cheaper to pay for the hourly rate for teacher training than it was for one-on-one lessons. So I joined the teacher training. And that's kind of how this happened. And every time I thought, well, this is a weird thing, why am I still doing it? I had this small voice say, no, it's really important, keep going. And I just kept going until I became a teacher. So pretty unusual. Most people who are teachers are not also... they don't have this background. They're normally kind of arts, performance, that kind of thing. So it's a weird perspective to have.
That's fascinating. So you started out in physics, and now you're teaching Alexander technique. Can you tell us a little bit more about where you heard of Alexander technique? Because I didn't come across Alexander technique until I started seeing it on Twitter, and I don't have an Alexander technique class just waiting around the corner. But I'm presuming that you live in London, and this is somewhat more of a common occurrence for you to bump into.
Yes, that's right. So I was first introduced to it in that singing lesson back at school. I think my singing teacher, just gone to some workshop, and then she said, oh, but let's try a thing called Alexander technique. And looking back, it absolutely wasn't anything that I recognize now, but it was enough to put the term in my head. And other than that, I would never have encountered it in day-to-day life. It's a thing that's normally done in the world of performance, actors, musicians, some sports, that kind of thing. I think increasingly it's going outside of that frame, but it's not something I would bump into in my day-to-day professional life. But it did happen to be in my head, fortunately, from that singing class. And on your point around, you don't have any AT classes around you, it is so Alexander was actually Tasmanian from Australia, but most of the teachers, the culture is kind of southern England, southern UK. There's a lot of teachers around here. And then there are various offshoots that in North America and elsewhere. But the density of teachers in my part of the world is probably the highest of anywhere, yeah.
Fascinating.
My read through it was via a friend who knew about singing as well, interestingly. And I had problems with asthma, was the health issue that made me try it. So it's interesting. The marketing's similar.
Yeah, exactly. All the marketing is around bodies, posture, movement, performance, that kind of thing. There's actually a couple of different schools of thought and kind of lineages, almost you could call it, in the AT world. And I know my teacher and I both gripe about this, that if you market it as performance and posture and that kind of thing, you get more of that. People think it is exactly that. But at the same time, you market what you can market easily, I think. So kind of telling people about weird mindfulness stuff is more difficult than saying we can, reduce your back pain or improve your singing, for example. So that's kind of how this marketing angle emerges, I think.
Right. So, because you've mentioned posture and bodily awareness, and the whole shtick of Imagine an Apple is about internal experiences and how that differs between people. Before we explore all that inner experience bit, I have a little test for you, which is can you close your eyes and imagine an apple for us?
Okay.
Can you see that apple, and what does it look like? Could you describe it to us?
Okay, so I can see an apple. It's existing in what I would call imaginal space, so it's not like an image I see in front of me, but I can still see the apple. And if I choose to give it more detail, I can. So I can, I can see it has a skin. I can see the stalk. I can see it's red color, all that kind of stuff. But I also, at the same time, can't physically see it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
You sound like you have the same experience imagining an apple that I do. But
cool.
Interestingly, not the same as an aphantasic. So let's go down to Alexander technique. And the first question I have for you is, how does Alexander technique guide people to become more aware of their internal sensations and habits?
So, okay. One of the things that I think Alexander technique trains very well is becoming aware of things that you weren't previously aware of. So kind of finding the gaps in awareness. And I define awareness strictly here as like the things that you are able to notice. So if you can't notice something, it's not in your awareness. And then as soon as you're able to notice something, it moves into your awareness. So for example, if you're not able to notice that you're hunched over and when you're like looking at your phone or typing or something, then you're not able to take action about it. Like it's just invisible to you as something that's going on. So Alexander technique, the way that I've trained in it, as at least, is very much a kind of coming back into the world to be able to notice more of these things. When I say coming back into the world, I want to just explain what I mean by that. It seems that there's like a spectrum of I call it the spectrum of consciousness almost. It's how alive you are to this moment in each moment. And most of the time, most people are on a kind of autopilot. So when their habitual ways of being are triggered, and this happens all of the time, there's something going on that takes people out of direct consciousness with the world. And then it might be various times you kind of wake up, you come back to the world. You can think of this as like similar to daydreaming or wandering off, zoning out, this kind of stuff. Like you realize that, oh, I've been somewhere and now I'm coming back to the world. I'm like, oh, where was I? I've just come back. And it's instructive to ask, where was I? Just kind of genuinely, and where have I come back to, and what is that quality like, and what was happening when I went away and when I came back. Because when you can maintain this more direct level of consciousness, then you're more able to notice all these kind of habitual patterns and these things that you're doing, things that are affecting you without realizing that they're affecting you, things that you're doing. So AT lessons are very much about kind of catching you when you go off into some kind of unconsciousness in this way, or the zoning out, and bringing you back and kind of helping you to notice the dynamics of that experience ultimately.
When you say going off, Michael, do you mean what's the actual experience of that? Like, because there's different categorizations of inner experience, like having imagination, imagining things, having inner voices, thinking about concepts directly, and then also things like paying attention to senses or emotions. Are you saying, is what you're saying when people lose the attention to the world, when they lose all of those? Or is it when one of those distracts them from being in the world, or something else?
Yeah, I think it's more like being distracted from the world in some sense. So my model of this is that we have a kind of simulation of the world running in our heads, and sometimes we go off and live in the simulation rather than living in the world to some extent. So that example I gave of kind of zoning out and coming back, AT teachers are very good at kind of noticing the zoning out. And so the inner experience of zoning out might be if your attention drifts onto your own inner monologue, onto your, your to-do list for the day, or this kinds of stuff. There is a kind of dissociation that happens where you go off into, let's call it, imaginal inner thinking, something that isn't what's actually happening now. And that's where the AT teacher wanted to like, okay, eyes are glazing over, there's lack of a vitality and aliveness. Breathing might get shallow. All these things will happen when someone disengages from contact with the world, and then that's where it can be quite confronting to have someone go like, "Hey, where have you gone? Come back," which in other contexts we don't tend to do that much. And then you're like, "Oh wow, I have to kind of travel some kind of distance, some experiential distance, to come back and actually make contact again."
And when you're making contact, what would your attention be on, or what would you be aware of?
So I put this as having your attention out in the world. And interestingly, out in the world can also include the body sensations and all the kind of interoceptive physical stuff. So it doesn't mean outside physically, it just means not in the simulation, so to speak. So at this point, you're paying attention to colors, textures, sounds, people, vibes to some extent, and noticing just as you want to kind of check out. This is where the world gets more vivid, the world gets brighter, the world gets more interesting. And yeah, it's really a case of noticing when you're not so present ultimately.
Interesting. Vynn, I'm going to let you carry on with the train of questions.
No, of course, yes. Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned things like direct consciousness, checking out, zoning off, zoning in. This sounds very much like a flow state, doesn't it? What's the difference, if there are any?
Good question. So I think it depends on how you conceptualize flow state as well. I think most people, at least when I think of a flow state, I think of being involved in some kind of working. So, you're losing yourself in writing or creating and that kind of thing. And I think that's a good example of flow with a contracted awareness. And it's possible to have flow with an expanded awareness. So when I say expanded awareness, I mean being available to notice more of the world around you. So flow state writing is kind of a small awareness and fully engaged. And another version of that in the expanded version is like playing a team sport, for example. Like if you're playing football on a big field, you're still very much in flow, I would hope, if you're professional. But you have that wide open awareness of the whole arena that you're engaged in. And the flow state is very much, I think, there's something about the flow state where you lose your sense of self and time, I understand, which is not something that comes up in AT in the same way. We don't talk about that. So when I'm in the AT state, so to speak, time seems to slow down. I have more spaciousness around time, but I don't wake up an hour later going like, oh, I've been so much in flow that I've forgotten the passage of time. Look how much fun this was. Oh, that was so great in that sense. But it's a different quality of, wow, I'm very present moment by moment, and I'm enjoying being fully present with it, and I'm very aware of time feeling spacious in that way. Honestly, I don't know enough about the neurodynamics of flow to compare, but I think there are definitely some overlaps in what we're talking about here. Particularly when you start getting at the spacious flow that I was pointing out, as opposed to the contracted flow. And I think people don't talk enough about that expansive, spacious flow.
Right. So one thing I'm really interested in getting your opinion on is people's self-perception at play whenever they enter into AT mode, if I can call it that. Because one thing that you mentioned before is autopilot mode. And as far as I understand flow states, there is a state where you enter into autopilot mode, where you stand beside yourself almost, and you kind of like let your body do its thing, but you're not exactly, what's the word? You're not, people don't feel like they're doing the action. It just kind of unfolds by itself. Whereas this, I think, is where it kind of differs very sharply with AT, because in AT you always have the option of doing or not doing. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, yeah, that's right. So AT is about bringing back a level of agency and choice in what you do. And it's probably worth talking about, there's almost two different kinds of autopilots that we're pointing out here. And one of my interests, if you like, is when one word has two different meanings, but we don't catch that because we just use the one word. So autopilot one, let's call it, is the more unconscious habitual mode. So in lessons, my teacher might like throw a ball at the student and then ask them not to catch it, for example. Or when they inevitably drop it, most people will go into kind of, "Oh, I'm so sorry, how clumsy of me, let me get the ball" type response. And even when, asking the student, "Hey, don't catch the ball," or "Hey, don't worry about doing this performative, I'm so sorry" thing, people find it very, very difficult not to. When there's a ball coming to you, you're so strongly conditioned to catch it, and when you drop it, we're so socially conditioned to, make it seem like we're more skilled than we are. Let's say, so that's a kind of low agency autopilot, and that's the thing I'm talking about when the consciousness kind of goes away a little bit. Like the activity starts, consciousness goes down a bit, and then consciousness might come up again when the activity is finished and the subroutine, if you like, it has completed. On the other side of the autopilot conversation is when you do watch yourself carry out an action in the way that you're describing with flow. So in that example, someone throws me a ball, or you throw a ball at the student, and you simply decide to catch it, but you don't consciously do the activity, but you still watch that your hand goes exactly to the right place, for example. So in that sense, the part of you that gets involved in coordinating your body didn't get involved, but your body was still allowed to move. That's we could call that autopilot, but it's a very much an alive, high consciousness autopilot. We're just not getting involved in the natural way of things, if you like. And AT is much more about that second one. We're getting out of the first one and allowing the second one.
Right. Interesting. And would you say like there's an intermediate stage between the autopilot 1 and the autopilot 2, where you're probably so aware but not agentic and unable to affect your surroundings?
So that's the journey of the learning, I think, is, once we come to learn that there are many, many ways that we interfere with our experience, and it's very, very difficult to simply not respond, or to prevent the habitual way of being from activating, put it that way. So if I go back to that ball example, if I throw a ball at a student and say, "Don't catch this," one of the ways in which they might choose not to catch it is to tense up their body. Is to say, "Okay, I will actively do not catching the ball," right? And that's not the thing we're looking for. That's another habitual response in interfering with things. What we're looking for is a just not respond, just not catch it. And then from that place of just not catching it, where you're not activating your habitual responses, you can then choose to catch it, which sounds paradoxical. But what you're doing is preventing all the habitual things that aren't working for you, or kind of their conscious interventions, shall we say. And once you've stripped all those away, a different system seems to come online that allows you to catch the ball or do whatever it might be in a much more elegant, poised, way that we're looking for in AT. But that journey doesn't just happen. Right? It can be occasioned to happen in a lesson with the help of a teacher, but actually going off and doing that in your own life, that's the learning journey. And that's where you have to kind of practice and come to become familiar with how the system works.
Right. So instead of just not responding, people sometimes actively try not to respond. And that's a very different type of not responding to the non-doing that is just not responding, if that makes sense.
Well, it does to me. But it's the difference between doing an action and doing nothing, if you like, are the same kind of category. So you're actively doing a thing, even if it's a nothing. On the other hand, there's a different category of thing, which is the absence of doing something. And that's what we're aiming for. That's the non-doing approach. I will not respond, but I will not respond in a way that is not also doing something else. And then the weird paradox that people realize is that from within that space of not doing anything, the absence of doing, a doing can emerge in response to in intention. But that's when you're kind of looking at it going like, oh, I didn't do that, and yet I did. That experience comes up.
So I think I can recognize this when it pertains to like bodily movement. And in your example, you used catching a ball, which I think is a fabulous exercise, because I've seen people do it, and I can see the difference between someone who actively tries not to catch the ball versus someone who's just sat there and truly in a state of being absent of action. But with bodily stuff, it's a little bit more obvious. Do you think it translates with mental actions as well? So think about internal shifts like mental, emotional, or even sensory experiences that a person might have during a session. Are you able to detect this as a teacher, or if this is something that even makes sense in the Alexander technique framework?
Yeah, and I think it does make sense, because one of the core ideas of Alexander technique is called psychophysical unity, which states that the mind and body are one continuous process. There's no separation between body and mind. So just to emphasize what that means, it doesn't mean that the body affects the mind or the mind affects the body. It's that they are the same thing. And thinking is a bodily act as much as moving is a thinking act. So given that, I think a good example of what you're pointing to is actually in the emotional world, which again is a psychophysical thing. And let's say that I experience some trigger in the world and I get angry. Like anger is a very good example for this, because it's such a strong and noticeable one for most people. So let's say that I notice my anger and I have certain habitual ways of responding to my anger. It's like, on the one hand, I don't like anger. I don't trust it. I think it's bad. At which point I will spin up all kinds of ways of managing that anger. In other traditions, you might call this a part, like in internal family systems, a part might spin up to kind of control my anger. Alexander technique doesn't use that kind of language, but it will notice like, hey, you're getting angry and then you're doing something. Can we help you to notice what you're doing and just put that down? Now, this is, again, in other traditions, you have more sophistication, I think, in this, around like, oh, a part to manage another part, for example, and AT doesn't have that so clearly. But it's the same stuff going on. You're picking up all of the various things that are happening to control experience, that aren't the same thing as just allowing what's going on, watching it, which is that kind of non-responding thing, and then allowing something to show up and emerge from that state of allowing. Allowing being another word for well, before I kind of talk myself into a hole there, let me go back a little bit and say that the move of not responding to a stimulus is called inhibition in Alexander technique. And I was about to say there that allowing and inhibition are the same thing, but now I'm not so sure, so I won't talk myself into that hole. But in the context of the emotion, what you would do is you would inhibit your habitual, your urged response to your anger or to a thought, perhaps, and then kind of be in the unfamiliarity of that thing, of that space that you find yourself in when you don't do the familiar habitual thing that you always do, because you find yourself in the unknown at that point. If you always respond to anger by clamping down, it will feel very strange when you don't clamp down. And the trick of AT is to stay in the unfamiliar and see if something else happens instead, rather than always doing the same thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Cool. Francis, do you have any questions?
This feeling you're describing when you get into that level of a kind of an awareness level to what's happening here, I guess. Did you ever feel it naturally before you studied Alexander technique, or would you say it's a skill that created something completely new in experience?
I had definitely felt it before, if not so clearly as a thing of its own, I think that can be described as an experience. So, for example, if I walk out into nature and look at a large landscape, I would have a sense of my thinking mind going away a little bit, feeling spacious. Experiences of awe and wonder, I think, are in this direction as well, where various mental processes kind of drop away and you are just naturally in the world. I think what was so confronting for me in that lesson was how quickly it was brought about um, in a lesson that was so seemingly simple. You know, we played catch, we walked around a little bit. My teacher caught me a few times when I wandered off into those habitual spaces, and then I walked back to my office, and the world was 3-dimensional in a way that it had never been before. The way I describe it was like I had, until that point, I had been looking at the world as if it were a painting on a 2-dimensional surface. So it had perspective in it, but I was still looking at a flat surface. And then after my lesson, I was like, oh no, well, there's actually depth though. Like there really is distance between those things that are in the foreground and the background. And that's the only way I can describe it. I've had that kind of thing before, and it does naturally arise, but it's much more haphazard and less obvious, I would say. Or I wouldn't attribute it to a thing that I did. It's just a moment of grace appeared in my life, and I can be grateful for it, but it wasn't as obvious in that way.
Right. So what's it like for people to confront this habitual tension or resistance within their bodies for the first time? What is it like for you when you experience it for the first time?
Well, for me, I was entranced, I would say. I think you need to understand the kind of person that I was, classic kind of geeky STEM nerd who was very disembodied, over intellectual, over rationalized everything, and just generally awkward. That's my framing now. I think I'm being probably unfair to him, but the only saving grace I had that made me recognize this was I was interested in Zen and mindfulness beforehand, so I could connect the dots. But the actual experiencing of it was like, wow, okay, there's this whole dimension of experience and ways of being that I was completely blind to, apart from those kind of moments of grace, as I was describing to Francis. So I was naturally very open because I happened to have the moment where I recognized this was important for me, that this was something that I definitely needed and would benefit from. I think how most people would respond to it depends on their psychology around control. So if you have this experience and you're someone who needs to be in control and be able to do it quickly and that kind of thing, then you can very quickly get in your own way, because the whole point is to put that thing down in a sense. So there's all kinds of traps around trying to control the thing that can't itself be controlled. It can only be allowed to emerge. And from there can be frustration and confusion and irritation, because you are learning a new way of thinking and being at that point. For other people, you might encounter this going like, well, so what? They don't get the clarity of experience that shows that there's something there worth spending time on, or they don't recognize the importance of it. In which case, fair enough. It's either that's because they already have enough of it, or because it's just not the right thing at the right time for them. So it really comes down to the person who's encountering the technique and what their first experiences are like, and whether they can map that to being useful in their lives. One of the issues in coming for a lesson is that it's nice in the lesson, and then actually applying that in real life, it somehow gets forgotten. So that you have to learn how to integrate it into all of your life and practice it in activity, which is how AT is done. It's not mindfulness like on a cushion meditation style. It's mindfulness in activity, in day-to-day life, doing the dishes, going to work, talking to people, all that kind of stuff, parenting. And if you can learn to be that level of present, to notice all the urges that you have to be habitual in those contexts, then you're able to do the practice. But a lot of people, that's just either too much work or not worth it, if you like. So yeah, it really comes down to the person.
I wanted to ask you anyway about meditation, and since you just mentioned a couple of things around that that you did, you knew about mindfulness and Zen a bit beforehand, and then I think you've already answered my question by saying that in Alexander technique it's about insight while you're going about your day, whereas say if you do Vipassana silent meditation retreat for a week's then it's very much attention of like detail of sensory experience internally and detail of internal world. Can you sort of how do you describe the difference between quite deep meditation and Alexander techniques? They're both about changing attention in some way.
Yeah, it's a good point. So to begin with, I'll say that my understanding of how AT is practiced and the way it works is most aligned to what I've seen in, let's say, in Zen, in the life practice side of things. So when you're going about your day-to-day life and you are fully there with what's happening, that's the closest I've seen, I think, in those traditions to what AT is about. But when I do longer sits, and I do meditate occasionally, it's not a big part of my life right now. I find that the Alexander technique skills are very useful when I go in that domain of awareness, if you like. It's like when I meditate, I do go deeper into a place, and the skill that I applied from AT is kind of noticing let's call it a cognitive process, or noticing a doing. We can call it a doing broadly, and knowing how to put down that doing without spinning up other doings, shall we say, if that makes any kind of sense. So another word for this might be unfixating, something that's clinging onto something, because this is ultimately what I'm doing in AT in activity. It's like, oh, I'm fixating on this dish when I'm washing it. I'm putting way too much effort into it. I'm really like giving this dish far too much attention, and that's causing secondary effects on my body and all that kind of stuff. How much of that energy, how much of that effort can I put down and come back into the world while still doing the dishes? It's the same thing when I go into meditating. It's like, oh, I'm putting a lot of energy into sustaining this thought loop, or into avoiding that emotion, or into not looking at that pain, whatever it might be, or getting even more esoteric, into maintaining subject-object separation between myself and the world. Like that's a thing I'm doing in a sense. Once you can notice that you're doing it, which is again the AT skills, like, oh, I'm noticing I'm doing something cool. Now I've noticed I'm doing it, I can put it down without adding any other noise to the system. So I think it really just comes down to like where you're looking, and how deep into the structure of the psyche you drop into, which I think is where more meditation gets into.
That's really interesting. So there is quite a strong relationship, but they're in slightly different but related domains. But
I would say so. Yeah, I think that people who do AT will find that they can apply the skills well in meditation. So open awareness, open monitoring, like do nothing meditation, this is very much in the AT domain. And vice versa, if you come to AT from those mindfulness meditation traditions, you'll go like, oh, okay, there's similar moves, my eyes are open, I'm walking around, if you like. So you have to be able to be aware of all the things that you're engaged in doing. Like, okay, I'm washing dishes, I'm going for a walk, I'm talking to someone. So you have that level of engagement, while also part of you is keeping aware of, hey, I just had an urge to say this thing, I just had an urge to whatever, and kind of dynamically put these things down or not respond to them. But importantly, that you can still also do them if you want to. So just to go back a little bit, when I said inhibition is to not respond to something, the really important thing is that you inhibit your habitual response to do something in such a way as you can still do that thing, right? So if I want to shout at someone because they're getting aggressive with me, and I go, no, I'm going to inhibit, I'm going to not respond habitually to give myself a bit of space between stimulus and response. In that space is the new thing that can emerge. That very explicitly doesn't mean that I can't yell at them. It just means that when I do, I'll do so with full choice, and it might come out a different way than if I'd just done it habitually and unconsciously, right? So it's not about self-punishment or self-restraint in that way. It's just about choice, but a choice that you can still do the thing anyway.
Cool.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So if Alexander technique is mainly about non-doing, are there any practices or exercises that could help one deepen your sense of alignment or ease?
There is one practice from Alexander technique that seems most relevant here. I don't think that FM Alexander ever actually used it, but it's definitely arisen in the culture. It's called constructive rest, which is basically where you lie on your back, probably with a book under your head if you have a space between your head and the floor, and have your feet on the ground, so semi-supine. And the point of this is that you stay alive to the world, so you keep your eyes open, you are alert, but you start to notice all the ways in which you are perhaps unknowingly holding on to your body. So in that position, it's very easy to relax fully and kind of let the ground take you in many ways. But after a few minutes, you realize, oh, I'm suddenly aware that I'm holding on to some tension in my leg for some reason. So you go from being completely blind to these tensions to then realizing, oh, there is some tension in my leg. What's going on there? And then you suddenly realize, oh, I'm doing that in some way. I've just realized that I am doing the action of tensing. And then you realize, oh, I can let go of that doing of tension, and then your leg relaxes. So it's like a meditation, but again, you're bodily aware, you're expansively aware, and you are not falling asleep, if you like. That's why I say eyes open. So this is a practice that anyone could do 20 minutes a day. Is just lie down and notice where you're tense and see if you can let it go. Otherwise, things that I recommend are encouraging people to kind of go outside on walks in nature if possible, but without any kind of input. So without headphones, without podcast playing, that kind of thing, without looking at the phone. And notice all the ways in which your attention is distracted by stuff that isn't happening right now, if you like. And this is, again, it's pure mindfulness, but it's very much an 80 flavored version of it. Of like, okay, I'm listening to the bird sing. I can look at the trees. I can hear general, the wind. And then, oh, look, suddenly I'm not aware of any of that stuff because I'm worried about my conversation I'm having with my boss in 2 hours. Like, can I notice that and just come back to the world? Because when you do, you realize that it's still perfectly possible to think about that conversation with your boss in 2 hours while also being in the world. You don't have to check out and kind of go off and do thinking. Thinking is a thing that you can integrate with all of life and going for your walk. So that practice is something you can apply basically everywhere in life. Is can you be with the thing that you're doing without going, as my teacher says, going thinky, going off in somewhere and losing sight of what you're doing. And the trick is to find those activities where it's easy for you to notice what you're doing, because some of them are just too difficult. Talking to someone who triggers you very strongly, for example, is really not the best way to start. Going for walks in nature, much easier.
So you develop being able to simultaneously be aware of what's happening around you in nature, and then you also might be having inner speech thoughts about the conversation with your boss in 2 hours simultaneously.
Yeah, it's as if they exist in the same space. So this would be easier to demonstrate if we were on camera, but let me describe it. When if I ask someone a question like, what did you have for breakfast this morning, or what are you doing later? In one version, they might kind of, this is like I say, going thinky. They kind of scrunch their face up. They look like they're thinking in a sense, and this is the going off somewhere experience of thinking. On the other side, you can ask the same question and nothing physical changes, and you don't have a sense that they've zoned out, but there's still thinking going on. It's just that you're waiting for the answer to arise in your experience rather than going looking for it in some sense. So if I were to ask, what was your breakfast this morning? I know it's early here. You know what you had, and you can just allow the answer to appear in your awareness versus kind of go, oh, I need to go and think about it. And when you kind of get that experience of thinking happening whilst in experience and whilst being attached to the world, directly connected with the world, then you realize that you're doing way too much work most of the time to think. Now, sometimes they get a challenge here of like, well, don't you need to have that kind of contraction to do certain levels of cognitive effort? Let's say coding, writing, deep thinking. And I actually don't know. I think we have lots of habitual patterns around thinking. Society tells us that we need to do all that, like look like you're thinking type stuff and block the whole world out. But I don't know. And I think a lot of, you look at some geniuses, in the sciences, and they kind of go for long walks and suddenly they have epiphanies. I think it's much more, there's much more of that than we think there is in thinking. And we've picked up a lot of bad habits around looking like we're thinking. basically they come from being at school and having a teacher yell at you because you don't look like you're trying hard enough, that kind of thing. AT is about dropping all the looking like you're trying hard, if you like.
Yeah, so thinking is one of those words, like you mentioned earlier, that has different meanings to different people. So specifically, some people assume it means imagining, and some people assume it means using your inner voice. I think I think in some ways I assume it is thinking subconsciously and not necessarily knowing the detail of what I'm thinking, like with forcefulness. But I'm wondering, what do you mean by thinking? My guess, I'm going to just guess what I think you mean, and you can correct me. I think you mean like proactively pushing your thoughts, almost like deliberately, like pushing the trail of an inner speech monologue, or deliberately imagining specific things. Do you mean something like that?
So I don't mean imaginal necessarily. I think I'm broadly gesturing at whatever we'd call cognition. So thinking might be doing sums or doing a plan for work or something. It can involve cognition. I guess it can in a monologue. I guess it can involve imagination. But you know what? As you asked me, I think I need to go off and learn a better definition of thinking, because as you say it, I realize that there are these different ways of thinking about it, and I'm not as clear as I could be on what I mean by that. A lot of AT is about reasoning through what you actually want to have happen. So, for example, knowing that you want to catch the ball is still reasoning out, and knowing that you don't want to get involved is reasoning out. So, understanding where you are and where you want to be is an important factor. So, if that involves using inner monologue, then fine. If that involves using imagination, then fine. All I'm pointing to is doing whatever that process is, and I can go off and research this better and come back with a better answer. But doing whatever that thing is, while also staying in contact with the world, and interfering as little as possible with the natural processes that will show up when you don't interfere with them. So yeah, thank you for revealing that I need to be better at understanding what thinking is, because that's clearly a hole.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, my guess is you don't mean the modality of thought, but how you approach it. Because this feels like a deeper knot. Because I can imagine thinking about something conceptually, because there's an unsymbolized conceptual thinking as well, or thinking about something within a monologue, and also having open awareness and attention to what else is happening. Because we know from descriptive experience sampling experiments that people, especially people who are good at things, can have lots of simultaneous stuff happening at once, and can work quite well. But there's also, I think, a thinking when you talk about the kind of trope of a scientist going for a long walk and then inventing some amazing discovery. Sometimes that feels, or waking up while you're asleep, you work something out and wake up in the morning with a new idea. I think lots of that's completely subconscious, where there's no awareness at all, which is to me a whole nother kind of thinking. So yeah, really interesting.
This reminds me of a distinction that I discovered while reading N. Catherine Hayes in her book Unthought, where she identifies the bulk of what we would consider to be like cognition isn't what we would consider to be thought. That is to say, it happens under the hood. It's subconscious thinking, or it's unconscious thinking. But she doesn't call it thinking. She calls that cognition. So there's the cognition that we're aware of, the cognition that we are conscious of, and then there's the unconscious cognition, which happens under the hood and basically keeps the whole engine of our body mind running, and it's always there in the background whether we want it to happen or not. But I think what happens when we enter into AT or mindfulness is that we sort of like lower the light of consciousness, which is like a metaphor that I find useful, where we kind of like go under the hood, I think is what approximates this idea that AT is trying to get at. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course.
No, I think that's right. I think I've used the analogy of like a supercomputer, or something that does parallel processing as opposed to serial processing to access what's going on here. So as Francis was saying, like when you have your spacious awareness, you can notice many different things going on at once, simultaneously. versus when you are fixated in a kind of this contracted attention mode, contracted awareness mode, it feels like there's just one process going on at once. So what we're doing is broadening out the landscape to allow for these parallel processes to happen. And I think where I got a bit stuck just now talking about thinking, one of the issues is because the human organism is a single integrated psychophysical thing as opposed to a brain on a stick in this model. So it's very easy, and I may have just done it there, is to fall into thinking as a thing the brain does, as opposed to a thing the entire unified psychophysical organism, to use jargon there, does. So is having an emotion thinking, is moving thinking, is in a monologue thinking. I mean, arguably all of it is thinking. Whatever thinking is, from my view, has to happen in all of it at once, as opposed to just one part of the brain, part of the system that we call the thing that thinks, if you like.
Right. So for you, potentially everything counts under thinking, which means you don't really make this distinction that most people make between thoughts and feelings. Am I correct? Potentially?
That's true. I'm increasingly coming around to the idea that, let me take a step back. I'm currently going into some, more research around, parts work, coaching, all that kind of like those models of the psyche of how we work. And I recently drew a parallel between a part in the sense of an internal family system style part and a pattern of tension in Alexander technique. So, holding a body part, for example, or whatever the doings are, and kind of realizing that parts as described by internal family systems aren't just these cognitive, emotional things in their own domain. They are psychophysical things. They are things that happen across the entire organism. So in a very real way, the thing that I'm noticing in the AT lesson with body tension and the part may very well be the exact same thing, just showing up in different domains, different places that I would notice them. So I think that's why I got a bit stuck with exactly what thinking is, because I don't draw that separation between places. But now I want to go off and think, okay, what exactly do I mean by thinking? So thank you for the challenge, given that I see the human organism as a unified whole.
Yeah, totally get that. So, I mean, just to bring it back to that exercise you mentioned before, constructive rest, where you sit down and then you practice, I guess, mindfulness, or I guess in this case, Alexander technique towards your body, and then being able to notice the subtle tensions here and there. Is it possible for one to be aware of this, to enter this state of awareness of one's body and one's surroundings, not just during the exercise, which is, 10 to 20 minutes, but all the time when one is awake? Because I remember coming across an AT teacher who made this claim, who says like, oh, I'm like this all the time. And I was skeptical when he made it. And I was also, whether it was like true or not, but also like whether it was valuable to be in the state 24/7.
Yes. So I would say it is possible to be in this state all of the time. And I would say it is likely desirable. But again, it's about choice. So if you do want to contract and be, not in this state for a period of time, you can be. That's up to you. The challenge, I guess, the question I'll give back to you is kind of test it for yourself. If you live more in that state and you find things work better, then do it more. The argument is that when you inhibit all of the habitual responses, better things happen ultimately, because the habitual things are learned responses that may be out of date. They might not be the most efficient way of doing things, as long as the reasons why the habitual responses aren't the way to go. But what I would say is that the thing that this teacher would claim to be doing all of the time, or having all of the time, is not something that you can get and then cling on to. And this is a really big trap that new students and teacher trainees fall into, is that, oh, I've got this blessed state, it's amazing. And then they kind of grip down on it and expect it to last, which is absolutely not how it works. It's a thing that you renew over and over and over again. And the reason that they can stay in that state all the time is that the renewing of coming back into direct consciousness, direct contact with the world, that thing becomes habitual in a sense. So you're just constantly like pinging, if you like a radar ping, like, yep, I'm alive, I'm here, there's the world. And that's just always running in a sense. It might, it might go away sometimes under stress or whatever's going on. But in my experience, by doing this a lot of the time, my baseline level of this experience has been increasing, so that even when I forget for a period, I don't sink as far, I don't zone out as far, I don't get as habitual. And that I have found is very much worth having. But I wouldn't want to say this is the best thing and you should all be like this all of the time, because that's actively counterproductive, I think, to the actual point.
Right.
What proportion of your time have you got to, would you say?
Good question. I still find it difficult when I'm using technology, and this is something I want to dig into more, actually, because technology is getting more and more pervasive. But when I'm not using my phone, then most of that time, I would say that I'm not on my phone. The issue is that I'm using my phone too much, particularly recently around election time, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
you find a phone harder than, say, a book or a television show or something?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for one thing, it's a much smaller space for me to contract down into, and it's a lot more algorithmic.
Yes.
I think that a lot of modern technology use and algorithmic stuff and apps and that kind of thing is very much designed to contract our awareness. And it's very much a non-natural thing in terms of human evolution. These things did not exist for very long in the existence of humans. And even though I have psychic defenses, shall we say, I'm still susceptible. And everyone is. And I'm very much looking for ways that we can use these things without harming ourselves. And I don't just mean forward head posture and ideological capture. I mean the full effect that these things have on the body mind. There's a load of things that can happen if you're not using yourself well, to use AT language there. And I think phones in particular are a big cause of it. So yeah, it's very unclear that this is a good thing from that sense.
Yeah, I agree with most of that.
Yeah.
Right. Just a reminder for everyone, we've just hit the 50-second minute mark. So do we have any more questions that we'd like to explore, Francis, or should we start wrapping up?
I think I'm ready to start wrapping up. Is there anything you want us to ask you, Michael, before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I will just say that I've really appreciated some of the angles from which you've asked the questions. You've definitely opened my eyes to things that I want to go off and research and think about more clearly to clear up my own confusions, particularly around thinking. So yeah, I'm just really grateful to you both. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a really good topic. I am intrigued by the comparisons to meditation, and actually, we had an episode recently about spiritual experiences as well, and just these kind of, and almost like your first lesson, almost as a spiritual experience, in that you completely changed how you saw the world.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting. And yeah.
Yeah, I saw the parallels as well. I didn't want to bring it up because it's sort of like it's very out of context. But our previous guest, Jessica, she spoke about spiritual experiences, and her spiritual experience, how it differs from AT, is that it's very much you get hit by this epiphany and just all or nothing experience. Whereas I think AT has a more gradual approach to the state that I think that Jessica kind of just snapped into.
Yeah, I mean, AT is very gentle and gradual in that sense. And if it's the same Jessica that I think I know as well, then she's gone very hard on insight as her practice. So she will be hit. Yeah.
Different one, although we do want to interview her about that.
Okay, got it. So different Jessica. Fine.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, Jessica Cornave.
Got it.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Any tips on if someone's interested in Alexander technique?
Yeah.
Obviously, you have your own courses. You can say if you want to say a little bit about them or any other things you think people should look at or do.
Sure, and thank you. So I do have this intro course, which is essentially a set of Alexander technique pointing out instructions, how you could put it, that will help clarify some of the points that I've said here. But aside from that, I think the two main routes to go would be, one is to stay alive to your experience while you're having your experience, and notice all the ways in which you check out from the world. That is a really powerful practice, and it's not unique to AT, but what it gives you is that the AT language gives you is the thing that, okay, now I've got that connection with the world, I can notice all the ways in which I'm going habitual, and I can make a choice to do something else. So that's the easy end for anyone to do. On the other end is go see a teacher. If you have one nearby, it can be a really interesting and profound experience. The only caveat I will give is that I am my lineage from my own teacher, who describes himself as being on the anarcho left wing of the Alexander technique world, is very non-traditional. So all this awareness and mindfulness chat you might not find in a traditional lesson. So if you do go, just bear in mind that the language used and the exercises might be a little bit different, but it is the same thing fundamentally.
Certainly, my experience was different in exactly the way you described, but it was still amazing. I remember being astounded by how my teacher knew from lightly touching my shoulders or something what was happening in my mind and what I was thinking, what was distracting me, what my subconscious was doing, and she just could tell, and it was quite magical.
Yes.
So it is quite an embodied practice to do in person with someone, is definitely how I think about it. But
absolutely. And that's the psychophysical nature of things. Like when I said, thinking is a bodily process, and it's when you think, it shows up. You can tell, and your teacher doesn't know exactly what you're thinking about, but they can guess the quality and the kind of thing you're thinking about from hands-on practice. It's really bizarre, honestly, but good fun.
Cool. So, before I wrap up, I'm aware that you, Michael, have a YouTube channel as well as an online course. So go check that out if you, dear listeners, are more interested in Alexander technique. And Michael, if people want to reach out to you, how should they do it? Twitter? Do you have a website?
Yeah, I would say Twitter's a good place to go. I am at @m_Ashcroft on Twitter, and my website is michaelashcroft.com.
Cool. We'll put that into the show notes. Thank you very much. And with that, I think we can call it an end.
Have a beautiful day.